My name is Evadne Merrick, 72 years old, retired art teacher, and stubborn enough to think I'd finally earned a life of peace. I had worked 40 years sketching in classrooms, saving every extra penny, and when I signed the deed on this Charleston house, I told myself it would be my sanctuary. The floors gleamed like calm water. The garden thrived with roses. And for once, everything felt like it belonged to me. That illusion ended the night I opened my front door and nearly stumbled over two massive suitcases parked in the hallway. I froze. Grocery bags digging into my arms. A coat I didn't recognize hung on my entryway bench. From the living room came the roar of a sports broadcast, loud enough to shake the picture frames I'd hung with such care. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat louder than the commentator's voice. Then she appeared, Sandra, my daughter's mother-in-law. She breezed out of my kitchen wearing my apron, smiling as if she owned the place. "Hope you don't mind," she said, not pausing for breath. "We thought we'd stay a few nights. Glenn's back is acting up again. And it's easier this way." Behind her, Glenn sprawled in my favorite armchair. Volume up. Slippers off. He raised a hand in a lazy half-wave, not bothering to lower the sound. I tried to speak, but my voice caught. "A few nights." It came out thin. Sharp. Sandra waved dismissively. "Just until Wednesday." She glanced toward the kitchen again, as though she had more recipes to rearrange. My eyes found my daughter, Maris, standing near the stairs. At 44, she was still the child I had carried on my back through storms. The girl I believed would always defend me. I waited for her to say something, to set a boundary, to remind these people that this was her mother's house. But Maris looked away, lips pressed tight. Her silence was worse than Sandra's smirk, worse than Glenn's careless laughter. The bags slipped from my arms. Tomatoes rolled across the tile. I stood there, trembling, realizing with a cold weight in my stomach that the house I had fought so long to call mine no longer felt like home at all. And that was only the beginning. I didn't always have a house with shining wood floors and a garden that smelled of roses. For most of my life, I lived in small rentals with walls thin enough to hear neighbors argue, ceilings stained with leaks I couldn't afford to fix. I taught art in a public high school, 35 years of paper cuts, chalk dust, and teenagers who sometimes cared, often didn't. The paychecks barely stretched to groceries, much less savings, but I did it anyway, every Friday. I slipped $20 into a coffee tin I kept in the pantry. When Maurice was little, I skipped lunches so she could have ballet shoes. I mended my own coats until the fabric turned thin as tissue, even after her father left us when she was 12. I kept the lights on, kept food on the table, and never let her see how close I came to giving up. Over time, the tin became a bank account, then a certificate of deposit, then something larger. I painted portraits on commission after school, taught community classes on Saturdays, sold sketches to tourists on King Street in the summers. Every dollar that wasn't rent or food went to the dream I held in my chest one day, a house that was mine. At 68, I signed the deed on this Charleston home. The realtor shook my hand and called it a miracle purchase, modest but sunlit, with a yard where roses thrived and an oak tree that shaded the porch. I remember walking through the rooms that first evening, touching each wall, whispering, "You are mine." Finally, mine. The kitchen became my pride sunlight, pouring in through wide windows. Counters I had chosen, shelves lined with pottery from former students. In the guest room, I imagined a yoga space, a small corner where peace would live. Each corner of the house felt like a promise fulfilled, the reward for years of sacrifice. Now, as Sandra banged pots in that same kitchen and Glenn barked at the television, that promise felt broken. Their coats on my bench, their laughter echoing down my hallway. These things mocked the life I had built. I had bled for this dream, but somehow it had become someone else's playground. It hadn't started with the suitcases. It began with Sundays. At first, Sandra and Glenn arrived with a bottle of sweet wine and a plate of store-bought cookies, announcing cheerfully that they'd been just in the area. I smiled politely. Though they lived nearly 40 minutes away, we would sit in my kitchen, Glenn commandeering the television as if the house came with him attached, while Sandra shadowed me at the stove, questioning every choice I made. "You don't use garlic powder," she once asked, blinking at me like I'd confessed a crime. I explained I preferred fresh cloves, but my explanation never mattered. She tilted her head, pursed her lips, and filed away another judgment. The visits grew predictable. Every Sunday, around 3, tires crunched in the driveway, and the door swung open before I reached it. They would settle in without invitation, Glenn stretching across the couch, Sandra asking what was for dinner. I cooked for 5 instead of 2, cleared plates long after they'd left, and rose Monday mornings bone-tired. When I mentioned to Maris that the routine was wearing on me, she brushed it aside. "It's easier for them here," she said, as though my exhaustion didn't weigh anything at all. "Their family. Mom, it's just dinner." But it wasn't just dinner. The guest room I had planned as a yoga space slowly transformed into their nap station. "Your couch hurts Glenn's back," Sandra explained after their 3rd afternoon of sleeping through football games. My carefully folded linens ended up wrinkled in their hands. Each week brought a new critique. The lighting in my living room was too dim. The water pressure in the upstairs shower was too strong. My towels, apparently, weren't folded the right way. And still, Maris smiled, convinced I was overthinking, that all of this was temporary. Temporary has a way of rooting itself when no one pulls it out. One evening, after another Sunday bled into Monday with dishes still stacked high and the guest room in disarray, I found Maris alone in the kitchen. Sandra and Glenn had already drifted off to the living room, arguing cheerfully about some television program. The sound of their voices carried through the walls, but for once, it was just the two of us. "Maris," I said quietly, setting down the towel I'd been using to dry the same plate twice. "One word from you, and they'd respect my home. You know that." She turned to rinse a glass, her movements slow, deliberate. "Mom, don't," she murmured. "I'm serious." I pressed, lowering my voice. "You've seen it. They move in as if I don't exist. But if you looked them in the eye and said enough, they'd listen. You're their daughter-in-law. You have that power." Maris's shoulders stiffened. She kept her gaze fixed on the faucet, the stream of water too strong, splashing against porcelain. "It's not that simple," she whispered. I stepped closer. "Why isn't it simple? This is my house. I have worked my whole life for this space. I can't keep living like a guest in my own home." Finally, she turned, but her eyes slid past mine to the window. "I can't upset Nolan," she said. "You know his parents help us. With the kids, with bills sometimes. I just can't." Her words hit harder than Sandra's critiques ever had. It wasn't reluctance. It wasn't hesitation. It was a choice. I reached for her hand, but she drew back as if the gesture might burn her. The silence between us thickened. Not the soft kind that once meant comfort, but the heavy kind that carried judgment without words. In that moment, I understood my daughter wasn't standing on the sidelines. She had already chosen her side, and it wasn't mine. The next week, Sandra announced at breakfast that the lavender detergent I used was irritating Glenn's skin. She slid the nearly full bottle across the counter as though returning spoiled milk. "We'll need something milder," she said. her tone brisk, managerial. I hadn't been asked. The choice had already been made. That same afternoon, Glenn commandeered the kitchen. He stood at my stove with a greasy spatula, flipping burgers and splattering oil across the backsplash I had scrubbed the night before. Gas burns hotter than electric, he mused, as if imparting wisdom. When I reached for the skillet I used every Sunday, he waved me away. Relax. Evadne. I've got it. Every corner of the house bore their fingerprints now. My pantry reorganized to their taste. My linens shuffled and wrinkled. The guest room, my yoga space cluttered with Sandra's cosmetics and Glenn's heating pads. I walked from room to room, feeling less like a host and more like a shadow. One morning, I found my neighbor, Mrs. Carmichael, waiting by the mailbox. She leaned close, voice low. I hate to bother you, but the HOA has had a few complaints. The parking, the noise on Sundays. They asked me to mention it before it escalates. Her eyes softened. I know it isn't you. I thanked her, embarrassed heat rising in my cheeks. To have my private humiliation spill into the neighborhood felt unbearable. That evening, I tried again with Maris. We sat together on the porch, the twilight heavy with the scent of roses I could hardly enjoy. Maris, I said gently, this can't go on. They've taken over everything. Even the neighbors are noticing. She rubbed her arms, eyes downcast. It's temporary. Mom, don't overreact. They'll settle soon. The words sank into me like stones. Don't overreact. After all I had sacrificed, after decades of dreaming of this house, I was being told my pain was exaggeration, when the door opened behind us and Sandra's laughter spilled out. Maris rose quickly, as if relieved to escape. I stayed seated, staring at the roses in the dark, the petals blurred by tears. For the first time, I felt truly erased, not just in my home, but in my daughter's heart. That night, after Sandra had finished lecturing me about how my towels should be folded, and Glenn had left another trail of crumbs across the rug, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the suitcase I hadn't touched since my last trip to Savannah. The house was still humming with their presence, the television downstairs, the clink of dishes. Maris's voice softened into compliance. My sanctuary had become a boarding house, and I was its invisible tenant. I pulled the suitcase from the closet, but not the large one. Just a small bag, a few clothes, my sketchbook, the silver bracelet my grandmother gave me when I was 16. I placed it carefully inside, the way you'd fold a prayer. On my nightstand, I left a piece of paper in my own handwriting if you need space. Now you have it. No anger. No accusations. Just truth. Spare and final. The house felt strangely light as I walked down the hall with the bag in hand. At the door, I turned once more toward the staircase where Maris had taken her first steps, where I had painted the walls in colors meant to soothe me. Then I stepped outside, closing the door quietly behind me. Lorna opened her arms before I even finished knocking. We had been friends since college, and she had a way of looking at me that stripped the years away. She pressed a glass of wine into my hand, studied my face, and said simply, "You finally did it." I walked out. I admitted, my voice trembling between relief and grief. "Good," she said firmly. "Silence isn't surrender. It can be strategy." That night, I slept in Lorna's guest room, a modest space with quilts that smelled of lavender and rain. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't listening for footsteps outside my door. I closed my eyes, and the house that had betrayed me drifted away like a bad dream. 5 days after I walked out, the first part of the plan unfolded. I wasn't there, but I had arranged to hear every detail. That morning, a moving truck pulled into my driveway, its engine rattling loudly enough to draw Mrs. Carmichael out to her porch across the street. Two men in uniforms carried clipboards and began unloading boxes stenciled with the name Radford in thick black marker. Sandra appeared at the door in my apron, confusion flickering across her face before she brightened. Oh, finally. We were wondering when this would arrive. One of the movers offered her the manifest. Delivery for Glenn and Sandra Radford. Please sign here. Sandra didn't hesitate. She scribbled her name as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Glenn ambled out behind her, squinting at the recliner balanced on the dolly. That's mine. All right, he said with a grin, piece by piece. Their new life slid into my home. Dressers thudded against the walls of the guest room. A full mattress swallowed the space where I once imagined laying out a yoga mat. Sandra directed the men with authority, telling them to place boxes of cookware near the pantry, her cosmetics in the hall closet. By late afternoon, the closet doors bulged with their clothing, the drawers stuffed with Glenn's sweaters. Before the truck pulled away, Sandra stepped outside with a roll of decorative tape and smoothed a neat strip across the mailbox. Just beneath my name, Radford, in bold letters, fluttered there in the breeze. Neighbors noticed. I heard later that Mrs. Carmichael shook her head as she returned inside. Another couple down the block whispered as they walked their dog. Looks like they live there now. From Lorna's window, I could see the truck turning out of my street, leaving behind the spectacle of my house recast as theirs, and I laughed, quiet, almost soundless. Sandra and Glenn had carried their own permanence into the walls I once cherished. They thought it was a gift. They thought it was mine. But I knew the truth they had signed for their own cage. All I had to do was walk away. It didn't take long for the shine to wear off once I was gone. I heard pieces of it through neighbors, and some through Nolan himself, though I never answered. The dishwasher was the first to go. It sputtered one night, flooding suds across the kitchen floor. Glenn had always bragged about being handy, but when Maris asked if he could take a look, he waved her off. Not my house. Not my problem. The mess sat until Nolan came home from work, already exhausted, only to spend an hour mopping instead of eating dinner. Sandra had stopped cooking altogether. She claimed my pots were too delicate, my spices too strange. She ordered takeout most nights, leaving cartons piled high in the sink, laundry stacked up as well, because she didn't want to touch another woman's things. Glenn tracked crumbs through the hallway, his recliner permanently angled toward the television. Maris tried to keep the peace, but without me smoothing every edge. The fractures widened. The HOA issued its first fine after Glenn parked his truck half on the lawn, when the second arrived for excessive trash left at the curb. Maris called me late at night, her voice frayed. I let it go to voicemail. It was Nolan who cracked first. A text came one Tuesday evening. Simple at first. Do you know where the vacuum bags are? Then another. Washer smells weird. Is that normal? A few days later. Do you still have your mom's roast chicken recipe? Sandra can't make anything edible? And finally, the one that stilled me. I didn't realize how much you carried. I should have seen it sooner. I read it 3 times. The words sharp as glass. For years I had been invisible in my own home, serving without acknowledgement. Now, in my absence, the weight they had ignored was crushing them. I didn't reply. Instead, I set my phone down beside the teacup Lorna had just placed in front of me. Outside her window, the magnolias swayed, their branches heavy with white blossoms. I breathed in the quiet, the kind of quiet that belonged to me again, and let their house crumble without me. The sale of the house closed without my hand in it. Nolan had listed it in desperation, under market value, and when the papers finally transferred, I signed only the necessary lines to sever what was left between us. My lawyer made sure of one thing: our finances would never be bound together again. Every account was separated, every bill redirected. What I had carried for them, I carried no longer. I took what remained of my savings and purchased a modest townhouse near the Charleston Library. It wasn't grand, but it had everything I needed: a small balcony that caught the morning sun, a patch of earth just wide enough for roses, and thick walls that muffled the world outside. When I turned the key in the lock for the first time, I didn't whisper a promise as I had before. I simply exhaled. Life settled into rhythms I hadn't known I craved. I brewed tea in the mornings without worrying about Glenn's booming voice or Sandra's criticism. I read in the evenings, the quiet broken only by the crickets beyond the balcony. Sometimes I hosted a few friends from the neighborhood, women who laughed easily and helped clear dishes without being asked. In their company, my table felt lighter than it ever had in the old house. The roses in my small garden flourished. I tended them slowly, pruning each stem, breathing in the scent that reminded me of all the hours I had fought to create beauty. For the first time in years, beauty didn't feel like work. It felt like reward. One afternoon, my phone buzzed. Maris. Her name glowed on the screen like an old wound reopened. I let it ring until it faded, then watched as the voicemail icon appeared. I didn't press play. Some things don't need to be heard to be understood. That evening, I stood on my balcony, wine glass in hand, the air cool against my face. A single sentence formed in me, as steady as the heartbeat I had finally learned to trust. Sometimes peace looks like absence. Sometimes it sounds like silence. Sometimes it feels like breathing in your own home and finally exhaling.